ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Kuan School of Public Policy. Can you all hear me in the back? Very good. We've got some thumbs up there. My name is James Crabtree. I'm a senior research fellow here at the school and resident Brit, and therefore I have the pleasure of chairing a British visitor. It's a very apposite time. It's our great pleasure to welcome Lord Peter Mandelson to the school to talk on the subject of Brexit and what it means for Europe and the world. Lord Mandelson needs no introduction, but I'll give a very brief one anyway. He's one of the most respected international figures in British politics, a former First Secretary of State under Prime Minister Gordon Brown, the Minister of the Government of Tony Blair. He was also European Commissioner and now runs an organisation called Global Council. The format of this evening is we will hear from Lord Mandelson, who will speak for about 20 minutes on his view of Brexit and its consequences. There will then be a response from the Dean of the Kuan School, Kishore Mugavani, and then the three of us will have a brief conversation. You will be invited to give questions, and then we'll wrap up crisply at 6:30 and let you get on your way. So with that, let me welcome you again to the school. Thank you very much for coming, and let me invite Lord Mandelson onto the stage.
Well, James, thank you very much indeed for the introduction. I'm sure it's very nice to be back in your wonderful school with its just blossoming reputation internationally. Congratulations. It's very nice to be associated with you and what you're doing here. I'm going to answer just about any question that you want to put to me about Brexit and its consequences, which are very great for Britain, very considerable for the rest of Europe, and I fear not insignificant for the rest of the world. But what I want to do initially in the sort of 20 minutes or so I have to address you is to talk more about the politics of why this happened, because it was a stunning result. I mean, it's hard to imagine a greater shock for political commentators and for the sort of political class in Britain to see millions of my fellow citizens effectively voting directly against their own economic self-interest. Just weigh that in your mind for one moment. It's not usual for people in elections or whatever to say, thank you, I am going to vote for revolt and risk and damn the consequences rather than for safety and the status quo. And all the political analysts, all those who were, talking about the referendum and what the polls were saying and what the likely result would be, almost without exception, said at the end of the day, don't worry, people will vote against risk. They won't really know what the consequences are. It will be like a leap into the dark for Britain to vote to leave the European Union. And at the end of the day, they'll take the Prime Minister's advice, they'll listen to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, they'll hear what the Governor of the Bank of England is saying, they'll notice what Christine Lagarde and the IMF has said. And just about every single economic institution, source of information, pundit, all saying the same thing: don't do it. Don't do it. And they did. Now, well, when I say they did, just bear in mind 52% of those voting in the referendum did. That's not anywhere near a majority of the British people. Just bear in mind. I mean, the British people were nearer 37% voted to leave. A smaller number voted to stay. And it will not surprise you that the opinion polls since the referendum are starting to indicate a fair degree of what's called buyer's remorse. buyer's remorse is when you sort of fork out a large amount of money to buy something which, when you get it home, you don't like the look of it, or can't quite remember why you bought it, or looking for the safety manual and the manual hasn't come with what you bought, or you thought there was an insurance policy to hand, but when you get home you look at the small print and realise it's got so many loopholes and qualifications it wasn't worth the money you spent on it. So already the polls are saying we were misled, we weren't told the truth, nobody said that there'd be a terrible economic shock, the pound would plummet, etc. And the truth is that actually people were told all these things during the referendum campaign, which was very long. The problem was that most of them, although they heard what they were being told, weren't listening to it. When we were in the campaign, and the government, Prime Minister, etc., were talking to people about economics, they were talking back to us about immigration. So every time the Chancellor got up and sort of wheeled out some fresh Treasury analysis or some new sort of gargantuan sort of figure about the loss to our GDP or the loss to our household incomes or this, that and the other consequence, these numbers simply bounced off people. Didn't want to know because they weren't sort of in the mood to be talking economics. They were in the mood to be talking about something completely different, and actually, it wasn't even really about Europe or the European Union that people wanted to talk about. I was absolutely flabbergasted. The week after the referendum, those of us who were involved in the campaign held a sort of post-mortem, and one or two senior guys from Number 10 came to the post-mortem, and one of them piped up and said, the problem is that we called a referendum on a subject nobody could understand. Now, you might ask yourself why that hadn't occurred to them. Anyway, and one of the biggest Google searches after the referendum campaign began was, what is the EU? Because people were really not at all sure what it was, what it did. I mean, they knew it was there, they've heard of Brussels, and they've seen these people, and they all go to these meetings. What they do at these meetings is rather vague. People come back from the meetings, and nobody really says anything more about it, and heaven knows what the consequences are. Basically, most people, and I tell you, this is not just about Britain. Those of you who are from other continental European countries, I mean, you don't have to stand up, put your hands up. Who's here from another European continental country? Just so that I can get a measure of the audience. I bet in each of your countries, your public are not absolutely sure quite what the EU is and what it does either. And they know about economic integration, and they know about unity and coming together, and they know that it's delivered peace in Europe for 70 years. I mean, we now live in a continent for the first time in history in which there is a zero risk of war, a zero risk of conflict. I mean, surely the first time in Europe. Am I not right? Going back how many centuries? God, we're the most bloody continent in the world. And now, because of the European Union, we have got peace and zero risk of war. And it's also given us, since it was created, fantastic prosperity as well. And what's now known as well in the world, what the European Union gives us as well as peace and incomparable prosperity, it also gives us size and scale in the world and enables us to exercise power in the world, which each of us within the European Union couldn't and wouldn't be able to do left separately and apart by ourselves. It gives us scale to match the United States. It gives us scale to match China. Now, why do people not realise this? Two reasons. First of all, people in Europe, political leaders in Europe, long ago either forgot the need to continue to explain what the point of the European Union was, or they forgot how to justify the existence of the European Union. Either they didn't see the need, or they just took it for granted, or they ceased to be on top of the argument, or whatever. But I tell you, in most European countries, but certainly Britain, politicians have long ago stopped talking about why Europe, why the European Union, and why economic integration in Europe. Which leads me to the second point, which is over the last, at least the last 10 years, I would say predating the financial crisis in 2008, people, even if they sort of feel that there is a point to economic integration in Europe, have long ago felt that they were not receiving the benefits and enjoying the dividend and the gain from economic integration in Europe. Before the global financial crisis kicked in, basically real wage growth was stagnant. Certainly in Britain and the United States, by the way, but also in large parts of Europe, and that had started some way back in the mid sort of 2000s. And at the same time, people saw industry in Europe declining. They saw our manufacturing base under intense pressure. People were losing their jobs in manufacturing. 30% of manufacturing jobs, I think I'm right in saying, have gone in the United States. 20% of manufacturing jobs in the last 10 plus years have gone in the UK. Actually, in the rest of Europe, they've been slightly more successful in sustaining their manufacturing sector, but they're still losing a lot of manufacturing jobs. But at the same time, as we are losing our manufacturing jobs and seeing stagnant real wage growth in industry, in the financial markets, in the financial services, you're seeing wage growth of 50, 100 times what people are experiencing elsewhere in the economy. And what people have become increasingly aware of is a growing sense of loss of income growth, loss of jobs in many cases. They've felt a loss of control over their lives. But also, as a result of this, and the huge changes in turmoil and churn, not only in the economies of our countries in Europe, but in the populations of our countries in Europe, people have also felt a loss of identity as well. Now, you put together loss of income, loss of job, loss of identity, and loss of control, because you feel that we are all somehow caught up in some extraordinary global set of changes called globalization, which seems to be great for a minority of the financial sector, but not brilliant for everyone else. And you have put together a political cocktail which was waiting to explode. And if you go to people in a referendum, which is a very crude and blunt instrument, and say, give me a binary yes, no to the following question, which people don't understand and don't much care about, they will project onto that decision all the other sources of dissatisfaction that they have, and all the other sources of anger and disenchantment they have about their lives and just about everything else, and that's exactly what they did in this referendum. Now, another point. Why is politics, why are politicians so hopelessly inept and inadequate? It's a very big question. Why is it that politicians are not able to sort of explain and interpret what's going on to the people about what's going on in the world? Why are politicians not able to pursue policies that sort of rebalance things so that people feel that they're not just complete losers, but that there is a government there working on their behalf? And why is it that the mainstream politicians and parties and those who conventionally operate on the centre ground of politics, why have they been most inadequate of all in carrying people with them and sustaining the political support they need in order to get into government and take the difficult decisions that you need to take once you're there. Well, I have been a conventional mainstream centrist politician and I'm proud of it. You know, I'm not of the extreme left, certainly not of the right. I'm of the centre left. And I have to accept and acknowledge that we failed. We were electorally incredibly successful as New Labour, and I speak as one of its architects. 3 resounding, brilliant landslide victories almost in a row. I couldn't be more proud of what we achieved. But we didn't sustain the argument, and we didn't sustain our electoral base, and we didn't sustain the support we needed to carry through and change our argument and develop our policies and revamp our offer to the public in the wake of changing times, changing attitudes and growing public disquiet. Actually, if this was a real truth and reconciliation session, I would have to admit that we spoke probably too much of globalization and too little of redistribution, actually. If I were to be absolutely sort of self-critical about this, I think I would acknowledge that. I mean, to us, globalization was a sort of a brilliant concept. I mean, it was a rather sort of academic concept. It uses words like free trade, open trade, free markets, all the other things that actually mean absolutely nothing to the ordinary man and woman in the street. But we spoke about them as if they were an unquestionable gain for people. But I tell you the problem with globalization. Without question, over the medium and long term, it produces very, very real and substantial net economic gains for the population as a whole. I wouldn't do without it. In the short term, however, it involves a vast number of individual losses. Short-term individual losses as people experience the change and the churn and the pain of the economic change that globalization brings, against the overall net gain that the economy as a whole receives over time. And what we did insufficiently was pay attention to the individual losers, whilst relying too much on our advocacy of the overall net gain. Is that clear? And what you needed at every moment to punctuate economic change was good politics and strong policies that enabled people, that equipped them with the skills, the self-confidence, the retraining, the opportunities for further education, that enabled them to move from industries to different ones, from one sector to another, from one sort of job to another. We didn't do that sufficiently. We did it quite a lot, but we didn't do it sufficiently. We didn't address the problems of housing. When we expected people, to move after jobs, we had a housing market that wasn't sufficiently flexible and didn't give people the sufficient opportunities for rehousing that they needed when they relocated and moved from one area to another, if they chose to, in order to move to different jobs. There were many, many areas, in other words, and this is really, really important for this school, because this is a school of public policy and public administration. If you want capitalism to work, if you want market economics to deliver, and if you want to sustain public support for globalization, then you have to put market economics, liberal economics, within a framework of strong government intervention and, I would say, social democratic policy. Social democratic policy that supports the individual. Social democratic policy that enables people to make changes during their lives as economic change makes its impact. Social democratic policy that creates many more winners than losers than we do at the moment, and would normally come about as a result of the operation of free markets. And I am a liberal economic man. I do believe in markets and I do believe in capitalism. But my contention is, and something that we have got to acknowledge and come to terms with in Europe and indeed across the West, is if we want public acceptance and support sustained for market economics, then we've got to make it work for individuals, for families, for communities, for neighbourhoods, very much more efficiently and effectively than we are doing at the moment in the West. It's therefore not surprising that as people have seen all this change and grown fearful of it, that their anxieties about it have grown. And it's not surprising that when people are anxious and fearful, they start identifying sort of targets. And their targets in the main, I mean, a lot of their anger and frustration is directed at foreigners. It's actually aimed at globalization, but it's easier to identify a foreigner than it is something, a concept called globalization. And that's why there's so much anti-immigrant feeling and hate, which is so easily whipped up and exploited by populist politicians. Do you remember the election that you had here in Singapore in 2011? Was it 11? I came shortly after, actually as a Lee Kuan Yew fellow. Thank you very much. And I remember all the discussion that you were having in Singapore about, you know, the results of the election. And people were saying, you know, immigration was a real issue. And they wanted fewer foreigners coming to this country. And indeed, I think I'm right in saying that fewer foreigners have come to this country as a result of changes in management by the government of migration into and out of Singapore. I think I'm right in saying that. I'll tell you something. The economy of Singapore would have been the silent loser from less movement of people, less migration. I'm not making an argument for complete open door for immigration, but here's the point, because it relates absolutely centrally to the referendum we've had on Brexit. As I said at the beginning, we were talking economics and people were talking back to us about immigration. We've now got a colossal choice to make in Britain about how and on what terms we step out of the European Union and then re-engage with its single market. And I'll tell you why it's such a difficult one and why it will present such a political conundrum for us, and it's for this reason. A condition of having access to Europe's 500 million consumer single market is that there is continued free circulation, free movement of people. In Britain, we can't come out of the European Union one day and re-enter Europe's single market the next without accepting free movement of people. Exactly the thing that many people in this referendum thought that they were voting against and in order to end. So in the years to come, as we sort of in Britain come to terms with this sort of fateful decision that we took in this referendum, the government is going to come back to exactly this point. They're going to say, well, okay, we've come out of the European Union, but we could be like Norway. Norway is a member of something called the European Economic Area, along with Iceland and Liechtenstein. Switzerland is not a member of the European Economic Area. Now, does Britain want to become like Liechtenstein? Frankly, I find the very question completely humiliating. It's a sort of an embarrassment even to pose it. Nothing against Liechtenstein, obviously. But, you know, you can say many things about Britain, but certainly, anyway. Now, here's the point. If you want to be like Norway and you want to be in the European Economic Area, you can be absolutely in the single market. You pay through the nose, by the way, for the privilege of doing so. You have to accept all the rules and regulations of Europe's single market, and you have to accept a free movement of people. Without being in that single market, we are going to lose a lot of trade, we're going to lose a lot of investment and a lot of well-being in our country. Doesn't mean to say that we're going to go to hell in a handcart. We're not going to sort of cave in and close up shop and die a sad death. But everything is relative. We will have less growth, less trade, less investment if we're outside the single market than we're in it. But if we want to be like Norway, coming out of the European Union one day, we're going back into the single market eventually. If we can negotiate our way back into it, then we have to accept free movement. And we are not going to get the British people to accept free movement unless we make a case for it, unless we stand up and say, actually, this is what migration brings us as a society and as an economy. And yes, this is how we can manage it better, because we haven't managed it perfectly in the past. And yes, migration does bring pressure on public services in different communities where large numbers of migrants choose to live. And yes, that does require more government spending, and it does require more government intervention. And yes, it does mean that people who are sort of born and bred in Britain, we need to make sure that they have the same opportunities to succeed and to get jobs and to thrive as those people who are coming from other countries to live in ours. Now, this is what politics has got to get right, and this is where I'm going to stop, because there's plenty more I could say, but I can take the question. If we're not going to sort of close down globalization, and I don't believe we are, if we're not going to all become sort of closed economies and closed societies, but instead are going to sustain the openness economically and in our societies that I think we should do and make for a better economy and a better society, then we're going to have to do a darn sight better job as politicians in making sure that globalization works for all and not just a few, not just the minority. And it does mean intervening to make sure that there's fairer distribution of the rewards, the economic rewards that come from globalization. And yes, it does mean government intervention to make sure that people have opportunities to compete fairly for jobs with others who are coming from other countries. And yes, it does mean that where there's pressure on school places or the health service or the transport systems or housing, the government is recognising that pressure being operated within those communities and is prepared to intervene and relieve that pressure and do something about it by spending more and acting more. Because if we don't do that, two things are going to happen. One, we're going to see continued movement of political support for fringe, marginal, populist and nationalist parties in our countries, of the sort that you've seen in UKIP in Britain, or Force Nationale in France, or the AfD party in Germany, the Podemos in Spain, and the whatever it was called in Greece. You're going to see all this continued slide toward populism and nationalism in our politics, away from the mainstream, away from the centre ground, if the centre ground politicians can't think better, sort themselves out, re-engage the public, have a proper conversation with the public and present policies that address those public anxieties and that public anger. If we go out of business as politicians, we will only have ourselves to blame because we're not doing a good enough job at the moment in moving with the times. And the second thing, if we don't get our act together and do it properly, is that we will see increasing pressure towards protectionism, towards closing our economies, towards closing our societies against movement of people and migration, and we will suffer the consequences as a result. And actually, my last point I'd make to you, 21st century politics is probably less about left versus right than it is about open versus closed. Just think about that for a moment. Let's continue the discussion. But that's what I think. These populists, it's hard to tell whether they're left or right. They sort of meet somewhere in the middle in a sort of articulated anger against change and globalization. But actually, what distinguishes people now in politics is whether they are for openness of economies and societies, or whether they're for protectionism and closed economies and societies. And I passionately believe that we will not succeed economically in this world. We will not succeed in sustaining welfare in our societies. We will not succeed in generating opportunities for the people of this world unless we maintain open economies and open societies. But it is those very things which are coming under pressure from populist and nationalist forces, and the reason why we're letting them get away with it is because the rest of us in the political mainstream on the centre ground are not doing our jobs properly, and we are allowing them to succeed too much in politics. That is the story for the British referendum, and it's a wider parable which we all need to think about and reflect on, because what happened in Britain on June 23rd is probably, in one form or another, coming your way, manifested in some other way. Last point, if in doubt, don't call a referendum.
Thank you very much, Peter, especially for your kind comments about the Kuan School. And I want to say at the very outset that one of the roles and responsibilities of the Kuan School of Public Policy is to try and provide thought leadership on issues of great interest today. And when a globally eminent person, somebody's calling me, I think. When a globally eminent person like Peter Mandelson comes and speaks at our school, you help us fulfill our mission. I also want to add that, like Peter, I'm a great fan of the European Union, and I do believe that it's a miracle that the European Union has created zero prospect of war in Europe. In ASEAN, in Southeast Asia, we have zero wars, but we haven't yet achieved zero prospect of war like the European Union. So what I'm going to say now in the 9 minutes I have left is I want to strongly endorse many of the things Peter said, but try to maybe add a little different dimension to some of the key points he made. The first point I was going to make is that I completely agree with you, Peter, when you say it's a failure of politics and a failure of politicians. But the deeper question is why? And if I had to give a slightly provocative twist to the answer why have the politicians failed, that one of the reasons is that after the Cold War ended, there was a tremendous mood of triumphalism in the West. There was this feeling that the Cold War ended, we won, we can now just sail smoothly ahead, we don't have to make any painful adjustments. And I think when the politicians got used to sending this nice, soothing message to the people, they forgot actually to tell them that one of the reasons why the West won is because you have capitalism, free markets, and with free markets comes creative destruction. With creative destruction comes loss of jobs, and you've got to make adjustments. And if you look at the record, it shows clearly that very few politicians were prepared to, in a sense, tell the people the hard truths that if you live in a world that is becoming more integrated, more globalized, you have to make adjustments. And I can tell you that if you look at the legacy of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and what he's contributed to Singapore, I would say that one of the biggest contributions he made to Singapore was to constantly remind Singaporeans, we are price takers in this world. The world changes, we adjust. The world changes, we adjust. And we adjust every day. And that's the kind of message you almost never heard in Europe. So it became very difficult then for politicians to actually tell the people, hey, I know you're losing your jobs. I know life is difficult. But that's part of the cost, and let's work together to try and solve it. But as Jean-Claude Juncker once said, he said, we politicians actually know what is the right thing to do. We just don't know how to get elected after doing the right thing. Right? So the politicians are aware of it, but they're not sure how they could find a way to doing it. So the failure of politics, I completely agree with Peter. The second point is that I'm going to mention, I'm surprised actually that Peter didn't mention this. If there's one thing that's going to happen that will be much more shocking than Brexit, that thing will be Donald Trump. And I'm sure Peter agrees that the whole Donald Trump phenomenon, the whole Donald Trump phenomenon is related exactly to the same thing. And there's a very angry, white, I guess lower middle class in America that feels that it is losing control of its destiny, that somehow rather everybody says globalization is good, America is benefiting, but my life is worse off, and I'm not benefiting. And it is this anger that is driving this Donald Trump phenomenon. And fortunately, all the polls show that he's not going to win. And let's hope he doesn't win. But I want to remind you though that 6 months ago, all my expert American political analyst friends said to me with great confidence, Kishore, Donald Trump ain't got a chance of getting the Republican nomination. And he got it. And they were all wrong. So I therefore view with a great deal of trepidation what's going to happen. But related to the Donald Trump phenomenon, this is certainly relevant to the School of Public Policy, is the fact that while Donald Trump is in many ways eroding the political foundations in support of globalization, he's also actually surprisingly eroding the intellectual foundations that support globalization. In the past, people would reflexively support free trade and say, of course free trade is good. But now if you watch the writings of even leading American public intellectuals, you see a kind of a gradual retreat away from defending free trade because they realize it may be politically toxic. And I begin to see the signs of intellectual cowardice among American public intellectuals, and that worries me a great deal. So my third and final point is, of course, and I'm very glad that Peter emphasized this at the end of his comments or so, we in Singapore and we in Southeast Asia are not immune from this phenomenon. It could also happen here. And here, if there's a message I have for my fellow Singaporeans in this room, it is that Singapore has probably been the biggest beneficiary of ASEAN regional cooperation, because it is thanks to ASEAN that we are in a region of peace and prosperity. And being the most open, globalized city in a region of peace and prosperity, we are almost by definition the biggest beneficiaries of this, what's happening around us. And the sad part is that Singaporeans have taken advantage of this ASEAN umbrella that's been given to us, but contributed so little in return to ASEAN. And so we possibly could make the same mistake as the British, and we take for granted something like the European Union. So we in Singapore should ask ourselves what we need to do to protect ASEAN and ensure that even though, the word Sexit may sound better than Brexit, let me assure you the results will be equally bad. So we in Singapore should prevent a Brexit. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore. Let me ask a couple of questions before we turn it over to the audience. Peter, you began by saying you were going to talk about politics. Politics in our home country has been a fairly fast-moving beast over the last week. We now have a new Prime Minister. We have a new Foreign Secretary as of last night.
You didn't even mention his name.
I wonder if you could give the audience your assessment of this new team and perhaps answer two practical questions. One of which is it possible that Brexit won't happen? What are the odds of that and the scenarios for that? And secondly, if it does happen, and you touched on this towards the end of your remarks, are we heading for, in a sense, a hard Brexit? Or do you think it is plausible, given the hardline Eurosceptics that are now dominating the cabinet, that, in a sense, the best option, the Norway option, is likely?
Okay. The first thing I would say is an aim off the fact that I'm not a Tory. Is that if you were to choose any successor to David Cameron, who you would guess would make the best fist of dealing with this situation, you would choose Theresa May. I can't think of anyone who is better qualified to succeed David Cameron in these circumstances than Theresa. The following reasons. One, she's intelligent. Secondly, she's incredibly conscientious and diligent. And thirdly, she recognises the need to keep in balance two things. One, both sides of her party, without sort of completely doing the splits. And secondly, keeping in balance Britain's economic, trade and business interest as opposed to the public's fear, anxiety and prejudice against migration. I mean, just to put it in those simple terms. Theresa, interestingly, supported the Remain side of the referendum very explicitly on economic grounds. She said, I don't like the European Union and I'm very sceptical of the whole thing. I can understand why nobody likes it, the usual little British thing. But I come down in favour of remaining in the European Union because I greatly fear the economic consequences of our leaving. And she said that for her, the economic case completely trumped any other consideration. Now, given that that was her starting point, I have to say she didn't do very much active campaigning for the Remain side, but then she was probably keeping half an eye on her own party and, and the competing wings of it. But that being her starting point is a very good basis, if you like, for her reaching a more balanced consideration of what Britain should do next and what its options are in the wake of the referendum result. And I think that although as Home Secretary, she adopted a very tough stance on immigration. Absolutely no pushover on that subject. Nonetheless, I think she will keep in her mind a sort of realistic perspective about the trade-off between the two, and I think that I think in a perfect world, an ideal world where she could make a personal choice, she would say out of the European Union, but keep in the single market with all the implications that carries for continued free movement of people. She doesn't live in a perfect world. She lives in a political world. And she heads up a government where there are, as we know, many contrasting views. And interestingly, she's put on the front line of this 3 Brexiters. I mean, I'm sure that there's a canny explanation for this, a sort of Machiavellian plan that she has. Well, I hope there is anyway. As to why she's put Boris Johnson in the Foreign Office, David Davis, who you probably wouldn't have heard of, but was one of the leading Leave campaigners as sort of Secretary of State for Brexit, and Liam Fox, the former Defence Secretary who lost his job for reasons that none of us could quite understand at the time, and has not become clearer since. He's made a comeback as the new Secretary of State for International Trade and was one of the leading Brexiters. So she's put on the front line the people who have to negotiate this and find a solution to these different competing views and interests. 3 people who, well, possibly they deserve this poison chalice. But there are 3 people who she can say to, well, look, you know, you've had the chance here, you've had the opportunity to make sense of this, now come back and bring me a solution. Now, quite what that solution is going to be, I'm not absolutely sure. I would like it personally to be firmly and fully in the single market, because as a former British Business Secretary and a former European Trade Commissioner, I know how vital our involvement in the single market is. And I know what damage to the single market would be done if Britain were not part of it, by the way, from a European point of view. So I hope that's what they come back with, and then take on the political argument over movement of people. But just now it's simply too early to foresee what will happen. She's taken the very wise move, however, in the first instance, of not immediately triggering the negotiation for exit. That's the sort of famous Article 50 of the treaty. Never been used before, never invoked before. No country, by the way, no member state has ever left the European Union before, so we are in completely uncharted territory here. But she's been sensible enough to say, well, I'm not going to sort of rush into this, I'm going to wait a few months and let the government sort of assess the situation. And I hope that that sort of more gentle, more reasoned approach will be what characterises her sort of navigating Britain through what are very difficult waters.
But to be clear, you don't really think there's a chance of it not happening? There's not going to be a rerun?
I really think it depends on where public opinion moves. If public opinion comes to the conclusion that they really do have a sort of serious condition of buyer's remorse, that they have really bought something which they didn't really understand and feel that actually they were sold a bit of a pup with. And by the way, where was Plan B? You know, because we expected to be presented with it on the day after the referendum, and of course that was before all the Brexiters took to the hills. You know, and weren't seen for dust. So public opinion may change, in which case a very interesting sort of political, legal question arises, which is that when you press the Article 50 button and you start moving forward along that sort of travelator, whether you have the possibility at any time in the next 2 years to jump off it if you don't like where it's leading you to. And this is completely untested. I think a lawyer would say no, once you're on it, and it's no turning back. But politically you might say no, at the end of the day, you know, you can always sort of find a handy spanner to put in the works and stop the travelator to enable you to get off. So it will be, look, we are in completely unknown territory, James. I can't be any clearer. I can't give you any greater insight because, as I say, all this is untested, and it does, at the end of the day, depend where public opinion takes us. The only last point I would make is that if you're going to get a change in public opinion, then in a democratic system, you need a political party to voice and articulate that change of public, to capture that public mood and articulate a change in direction. The only available instrument, if I can call the Labour Party an instrument in the present time, is my party. I mean, it could come together, realise that we're heading over a cliff here and we should lead public opinion in fact possibly taking some steps back and make sure that we have an early general election and present a choice in a general election represented by two competing parties. That's what normally happens in a democracy. The problem is, as you may have noticed, my party isn't really at the races at the moment. It lacks a half-credible leader. It lacks a united front bench prepared to line up behind that half-credible leader, because in the meantime, 80% of Labour MPs have passed a vote of no confidence in the guy who's leading the party at the moment. And that's going to work its way through the summer with a very uncertain outcome in the autumn.
I want to bring Kishore back into this, but with your forbearance, I want to ask one other quick question, which is, could you conceive of a circumstance in which you would support the splitting of the Labour Party, in which, in a sense, those from your wing, those who support openness, who are currently on the back foot under Mr. Corbyn's, I mean, could you conceive of that being a possible outcome?
Well, I mean, I can conceive of it. Whether it's likely, whether it's sort of inevitable, or whether I personally would support it, a completely different question.
Would you support it?
No.
Kishore, looked at from Asia, I mean, you've been the leading theorist, I think, of the rise of Asia, the Asian century. You're often quite critical of the West. How bad does this look? And seen from Beijing and from Moscow, is there actually a sense that actually other rising powers around the world are looking at the mess in Europe and the potential mess in America and thinking that this is actually a rather good thing?
Well, I hope my answer is good news to you. Most Asians don't think it's a good thing. I mean, and by the way, since you mentioned Russia and China, it's important to emphasize there's a big difference between the Russian reaction and the Chinese reaction. I think Russia, clearly, many in Russia celebrated. I mean, that's why I know they did when the results came out. But then for Russia, it means a much weaker Europe to deal with. But I think from the point of view of China's long-term geopolitical interests, China's calculations are quite different. And China actually found it very useful to have a strong European that from time to time would balance the United States. And the UK's role inside the EU has been helpful to China. UK was the first country to join the AIIB. UK has been very receptive to having a greater Chinese presence in London and so on and so forth. So I think from China's point of view, the breakup of EU is a geopolitical minus rather than a geopolitical plus.
And what about the lesson of Europe? I mean, as Europe struggles, you are a big supporter of ASEAN. Your next book is making the case for ASEAN as a regional bloc. But the lesson of Europe at the moment, as Peter outlined, is the difficulty of this kind of transnational cooperation. Does it give you pause about Asia's future to look at the struggles that Europe is currently having?
The good news about ASEAN, as I always say, is the world's most perfect, imperfect creature. So ASEAN's weaknesses and limitations are the source of its strength. And I mean, I always say that when you watch ASEAN move in slow motion, it's always taking 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, 1 step sideways. It looks like a crab going around and around in circles, but you slice ASEAN decade by decade, it keeps moving on. So the fact that ASEAN is not rigid, legalistic, driven by hard agreements, the fact that it has a very loose structure of decision making, it has an ASEAN minus X principle, and as you know, ASEAN, for example, is not agreed on how to respond to China's actions in South China Sea, clearly. Despite that, ASEAN will keep stumbling on. So that I see, having worked with ASEAN for, I guess over 30 years, you always find that sometimes you see that ASEAN is just about to break apart, and then it keeps moving on. So that I see as the relative, competitive advantage of the looseness of ASEAN as compared to the European Union.
Peter?
My view on ASEAN is don't force the pace, but always make sure that incrementally it's moving forward. And I tell you why I say this. When I became Europe's Trade Commissioner in 2004, one of the first things I did in the year after I took office was to launch a scoping exercise with my counterparts in each of the ASEAN countries to set out what sort of free trade agreement we can negotiate between the EU and ASEAN. And the scoping exercise was brilliantly done, not by me, but by the officials who were working on it. Really set out a roadmap which showed where the real tangible opportunities lay, economic advantages could be created, both for the ASEAN members and for the European Union by working in closer economic and trade partnership together. And it didn't take off because ASEAN wasn't ready to, as it were, to press the button for an actual negotiation, for reasons that I understand. But I think that when you think about ASEAN, you should keep your sort of eyes trained on two really important things. One is the huge trade growth potential of creating a single customs union, a genuinely integrated regional economic space, because not only does that promote ASEAN regional trade to a much greater extent than exists at the moment, but it also increases the incentive and the attractiveness to others in the rest of the world to trade with and in this part of the world, because you know that in doing so, you're not just trading with one country's market, but you're trading with an entire economic area when the customs barriers and national frontiers are diminished. And that really will, that growing integration of ASEAN countries into the international trading system and the global economy will, in my view, bring great economic and welfare benefits to the people of ASEAN. But secondly, it is politics. You just know that a country, even one as big and powerful as China, is going to think twice in picking a fight with a particular country. I'm talking entirely theoretically here, obviously. In picking a fight with one country when you know that a number of others are going to come in behind that one country and act together as a bloc. So it gives you not just prosperity, but it also enhances your power when you're working together. And that's the sort of frame within which I think people should be thinking about ASEAN. As I said, forcing the pace, presenting a sort of a blueprint in which you seem to be wanting to dispel or destroy different countries' national identities or whatever, or subvert their sovereignty or take away their democracy. That isn't going to work. Why should it? We don't actually want it in Europe. You shouldn't want it here. People like their countries. They like their political institutions, and they like how their democracies work on a good day, etc. but nonetheless creating a political framework which enables that really intensive cooperation and economic integration has huge value, and that's the course I hope that ASEAN continues to embark on.
Let me ask one final question before I open it up for a couple of questions to the audience, which is about Europe and the future of Europe. You're noted what in Britain are called pro-Europeans. There is now a risk that what happened in Britain spreads, as you mentioned. I mean, you have the Italian referendum in October, you have the French upcoming election, a wave of anti-European sentiment, populist parties on the rise. Can this be stopped, and can the European Union reform itself in a way that makes it more popular, do you think?
I think it can and it should. It needs to be more aware, not of the democratic deficit that exists within the European Union, because after all, it's not a single federal United States of Europe that we're trying to create here. Therefore, you shouldn't be thinking of how you can create a government of Europe. You know, it's a connection of sovereign states that choose to pool their sovereignty in a number of key respects. And it is right that you have a European Parliament to reflect public opinion and to be a sounding board for public opinion and to play its part in the legislative process in Europe. But equally, it's just as important to have the respective member states and their national governments in the driving seat of the European Union's direction of policy making, because, as I say, the European Union is a collection of sovereign states. It's not a single federal country that we're trying to create here. But having said that, I would like the EU and its institutions and its leaders just to be a little bit more aware, not of the democracy deficit that exists, but something, I think, what I would call the legitimacy gap or the legitimacy deficit that exists in the European Union. It's what I said and addressed right at the beginning. People have tended to forget what it's there for. People are not quite sure now what its purpose is. Politicians have overlooked the need to keep reminding people or explaining people or putting their justification for the continued existence of the European Union in a 21st century context, as opposed to the original driver of European unity after the Second World War, which was to forge a set of conditions in which it was no longer possible for European countries to go to war with each other. Now, we take that piece for granted for good reason. What we are not now so good at is investing in the European Union a 21st century purpose for it, in addition to sustaining and maintaining that peace. And to me, that is about prosperity and it is about power. And what I would like to see is the EU just doing a little bit more to prompt national governments and national political leaders to sing and speak from a single script or hymn sheet about what the purpose of the European Union is, because there are too many people who have either forgotten or didn't realise in the first place.
Let me ask Kishore to respond to that and then say that if you want to ask a question, the form of the Lee Kuan Yew School is you have to position yourself in front of one of the microphones. I'm afraid we're only going to have time for a couple of questions, so if you find yourself at the end of a long line, you may be unlucky. But Kishore, what advice from Asia would you give to Europe before we turn over to the question?
Well, let me make a very quick point. Today is Europe Day for me, because this morning I was actually on a panel together with the former foreign minister of Germany, Joschka Fischer. And Joschka Fischer said that in the same discussion we were having about Europe's future and all that, he emphasized actually the same key point that Peter just did, that it cannot just be purely an economic project. It's got to be a project which reflects the dreams of the Europeans, hopes and dreams of the Europeans. So it's not just about economics, it's about what your heart says about Europe. I think that's a critical point. I agree with Peter.
Very good. I'm afraid, with apologies to the 9 of you standing up, I think we're only going to have time to take 3 questions. So with a sense of exactly the type of social democratic egalitarianism that Peter was proposing. I'll take one from each microphone and ask you to give your question. So the gentleman there first, keep your question brief, please. And
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you for a very learned lecture. So there's something you may have forgotten, and that is Her Majesty the Queen. She is the head of the Commonwealth. Now that is a number of countries and continents that could be a solution to Britain's problem. And I think the Commonwealth, as you know, you have rising countries like the subcontinent of India, Pakistan, you have Canada, you have Australia, you have the whole world. And I think you should have a conference of the Commonwealth countries to see how they can help out in this situation.
It's a good point.
Thank you.
It's a good point. I think we can deal with that, sir.
Yes. Lord Mandelson, you ended your remarks by saying that the debate nowadays is not right versus left, but openness versus closeness. And indeed that's what we saw at the Brexit debate, and we are seeing it at the American election debate, and we are seeing it at Europe at large. But I'm wondering, is it the right debate? On the one hand, it seems to be an outdated debate, meaning you cannot reverse the effects of globalization or openness. But more than that, I think it's the wrong debate, because the true challenge for developed societies is not outside of the borders, but inside of them. And it comes essentially by disruptive technology, by the challenge that's talent posed by disruptive technologies. A well-known 2013 report by Oxford University states that in the next 10 to 20 years, 50% of American jobs are to disappear as a result of disruptive technologies. Hence, my question is, instead of debating openness versus closeness, developed societies shouldn't be discussing what is the right amount of technological change that they are ready to accept.
Very good, thank you. That's a very good question. And now the gentleman in the middle.
My name is JK. I'm retired. I worked for the British all my life in San Derby, Little Sembawang.
Very good, we're grateful.
Now, I have 4 bosses who are marvelous British, who create tons of value. One is an accountant, one is a soldier boy, one is a farmer, and one is a trader. In San Derby, the farmer is the best. Why? Because he creates value, and he delivers value, and he captures value for the British.
Now let me push you on a
Now,
question.
today, where are the young British that will deliver value for Britain? And how you share your value with the British? Where is your market? Your market is in the Commonwealth. The 2 to 3 billion people that gives you the livelihood, where you can capture your value.
Very good. Okay, thank you. Let me, so I'm afraid I think that's all the questions we're going to have time for, so my apologies. So let me turn back to the audience and draw these together. I'm sorry. We're going to, hang on, I'm going to have to stop you because otherwise we're going to run out of time and everyone will start moving to the exits. So those are sort of clumped into two broad issues. I mean, the gentleman's question and the first and third question both mentioned the Commonwealth, but they were, in a sense, asking what future for Britain outside the European Union and where do you look for growth. The second question asked you about technology, posing this question of whether the distinction that you drew between openness and closure was the appropriate way to think about the path for industrial economies. So maybe I could invite both of you to answer those, and then we'll close the debate. So let me go to Kishore first, and I'll let Peter have the last word.
I'll be very brief. I was just asked by Chatham House to write an article on does UK have a future outside the EU? And my answer, of course, is preferably UK should stay in the EU, but here are some second best options. So in one of them, I do mention that it should consider playing a role with the Commonwealth. So that's one possibility. But that's the second best option. But look at the Chatham House article. It should be on the website.
My answer is similar to Kishore's, and it is this. Britain, of course, has a future outside the European Union if it chooses to take it. But it will not be a future which is driven by as fast a rate of economic growth than we would otherwise have. It will, to a greater or lesser extent, de-liberalise trade between Britain and the European single market, depending on what option we ultimately go for. And the reason why, denying us the full sort of benefits of liberalised trade in Europe is a problem for us is because the alternative sources of trade growth come from some very large, highly populated, fast-growing economies elsewhere in the world, which are nonetheless and will be for some time to come relatively protected economies. China, India, Brazil, huge populations, fast-growing, but they're very, very careful about where and how and at what speed they open up their economies to international trade. And because they are somewhat sort of slow off the mark and quite careful about the pace at which they open up, it means that Britain, looking to those alternative sources of trade growth, will have a smaller opportunity, not a non-existent opportunity, and not ultimately a very large opportunity, but in the meantime, a smaller opportunity than people imagine. And for me, the sort of idiocy of this is why on earth should we be forcing ourselves in Britain to make the choice? To retain our, as it were, our home market versus our alternative growing international markets. We can have both. The whole point of being in the European Union is that you become, if you're a business, big in Europe in order to become big in the world. What big in Europe means is because you are exposed to such intensive competition in Europe's single market, it drives your technology absorption, it drives your productivity growth, it drives your performance and expansion as a business to a much, much greater extent than would be the case than if you were competing with businesses in Pakistan or Botswana. Now, eventually, Pakistan, Botswana, and other Commonwealth countries are going to be really important markets, for Britain. And indeed, Britain's trading relationship through the Commonwealth with those countries is going to be a very important source of economic growth and rising living standards in those Commonwealth countries, which is why I'm a Commonwealth man, partly for historical reasons, but also for sort of future economic growth reasons and welfare reasons in those Commonwealth countries that I want to see expand and grow and create the same opportunities for their populations that we have in our own country. But in the meantime, Britain does have to be realistic our main competitive stimulus comes from other countries which are at a similar stage of economic development and from competitor businesses in those countries, which is in a sense give us the run for our money that we need in order to, you know, increase our performance and our productivity growth. It's why, before Britain went into the European community, as it then was in the 1970s, we were commonly called the sick man of Europe. We had become sluggish, productivity was stagnant, our businesses were, frankly, complacent, because we sort of had these ex-colonial, now Commonwealth markets in which we dabbled, but didn't really force the pace in, exerting and operating that really tough competitive pressure that you need if a business is going to grow in performance. And my God, did we get a kick up the backside and a shot in the arm when we entered the European community, even more so when the single market was created in the 1990s. And our performance and growth shot off as a country because of it. And in a sense, my main worry about leaving the European Union and its single market, quite apart from the diminished political status that we will have as a country and the diminished soft power that we will be able to exercise both within Europe and through Europe in the rest of the world, is that we will lose to a very great extent that tough competitive stimulus that you need in order to improve your economic performance. And as a source of technology, as a source of new ideas, as a source of new people, as a source of new management. I mean, this is what drives prosperity and the fruits of that prosperity, which, as I said at the beginning, you need better to distribute amongst your people. But in the first instance, you need to create the wealth, and you need to do so in markets which are really going to operate that stimulus on you. So don't please ask us to make the choice. Let's have our home market of Europe. Let's also continue to work and trade with the Commonwealth. Let's get to a position where we're able to trade into and take on the emerging economic giants of the world. And let's continue our fantastic sort of trade and investment partnership, by the way, with the United States as well. Why make a choice between these things when you are in the enviable position that Britain has been in for the last 40 years of literally having the best of all these worlds? And I don't want to see us giving up any of those worlds. I want to keep them, and I want to keep harnessing our country and its economic growth and its political influence to all those different worlds around the globe. And that's personally what I'm going to keep working for when I leave you tonight and return to my own country, which I love.
Very good. Well, thank you.